Greetings, friends, and welcome back to the podcast of Jewish Ideas, a Torah in Motion podcast. I'm JJ Kimchi. In the early decades of the 19th century, a new intellectual movement gained traction among Jewish scholars in Central Europe. Scholars associated with this movement sought to study the history and texts of Judaism not through traditional or rabbinic lenses, but rather through the modern tools of history, philology, and scientific analysis. This so-called scientific study of Judaism, often known by its Germanic title of Wissenschaft des Judentums, represents a revolution, both in the way that Jews presented their own culture to the outside world, and also in their own conceptions of their historical and religious identities. Members of this movement drew both admiration and ire from colleagues across the world, and its ideology remains a subject of contention to this day. Joining us today to discuss the Wissenschaft des Judentums movement is a foremost authority on the subject, Dr. David Myers, who is the Distinguished Professor of History and Chair in Jewish History at UCLA. Among many other topics, Professor Myers has written widely on the history of Jewish historiography, with his most recent work on the subject being The Stakes of History, The Use and Abuse of Jewish History for Life, published by Yale University Press in 2018. It is a pleasure to welcome Professor Myers to the podcast of Jewish Ideas. Welcome.
Great to be with you, JJ, and great to talk about Wissenschaft des Judentums.
Excellent. I'm very excited for this. Okay, so first and foremost, let us set a little bit the historical stage. So I mentioned this movement rose in the early decades, say, of the 19th century. So could you perhaps paint a picture of what was going on in the Jewish world and more broadly in the world back then? What were the political, social, religious conditions that gave rise to this new way of looking at Judaism?
Right. So first of all, we can actually point with some degree of precision to the inception of the movement, because in November 1819, a group of Jewish intellectuals in Germany, in Prussia in particular, Berlin, gathered as the Verein für Kultur und Wissenschaft der Juden, the association or club for the culture and science of the Jews. They did so in the immediate wake of a series of anti-Jewish pogroms that broke out throughout the various German states, known as the Hep riots. So there was a real sense of trepidation and fear and anxiety that accompanied the rise of this new scholarly movement. We're talking about a movement that was populated by really the first generation of university-trained Jewish students. Prior to this time, Jews had been prohibited from attending university, with a number of exceptions, especially in the field of medicine. But we have this first generation of university-trained Jewish students gathering in this most intense period, a time of political reaction marked by the Congress of Vienna of 1815, which sought to reorder the map of Europe after the defeat of Napoleon and pushed back against ideas of liberalism and democracy and certainly revolution that Napoleon sought to introduce, as did the French Revolution a bit earlier. So this is a period of reaction, and what that meant in part was that the erstwhile steps toward political emancipation that we see in Prussia in the early part of that decade, in 1812, were now put on hold. And this was a source of great concern to Jewish intellectuals. Political emancipation meant the granting of rights of citizenship to all subjects within a particular realm, including Jews. So the group gathered in 1819 for the purposes of promoting scholarship. And one of the interesting questions is, what, pray tell, might that have to do with political emancipation? We'll no doubt unpack that.
Right. Fair enough. Excellent. So the Wissenschaft des Judentums movement, as you mentioned, did start with this very small official circle club in 1819. But in the following decades, it obviously expanded into something like a loose constellation of scholars, who were classified under a certain umbrella in the Wissenschaft world. So I was wondering, could you perhaps give us a very brief group portrait of the major figures in the Wissenschaft movement? Who are we talking about, and roughly what years are we addressing?
Right. So I want to just go back to that first group, that first cohort, who mark a kind of remarkable transition from a world of yore to the new world of enlightened Europe, which we might well put in scare quotes in light of what I just began with. So two very important and representative figures are Isaac Marcus Jost, who was the author of perhaps the first modern history of the Jews written by a Jew, a 9-volume history of the Israelites, as he entitled the series, and Leopold Zuntz, arguably the most important scholar to emerge from the Wissenschaft des Judentums movement over the course of the 19th century. These two men actually met at a school for orphans in Wolfenbüttel, Germany, where they were introduced after a new director was appointed in 1807 by the name of Samuel Mayer Ehrenberg, a new curriculum that included modern approaches to education, which this school for orphans did not include before. So it was at that point that these two young boys were exposed to the German language, which they took to very quickly. And a mere 12 years later, they were amongst the founders of this movement for Jewish scholarship. In fact, a year before the meeting of the Verein in 1818, Zuntz, at 23 years of age, wrote a sweeping programmatic essay for what would become the Wissenschaft des Judentums movement called Etwas über die rabbinische Literatur, on rabbinic literature, which was on subjects far wider than what we might call merely rabbinic literature. It was really an exhaustive program for what a new serious scholarly study of Jewish sources through a critical lens should look like. These two men, Jost and Zuntz, were amongst the founders of modern Jewish scholarship. And what is interesting in both of their cases is the extent to which they married their intense commitment to elevating Jewish scholarship to a niveau, a level that could be the pride of their non-Jewish companions and contemporaries. That was one impulse, to elevate Jewish scholarship to the rank of science, which is rendered in German as Wissenschaft. We can sort of talk about that, what that meant. But at the same time, and this is really reflective of Wissenschaft des Judentums from its inception throughout the 19th century, they also sought to use scholarship instrumentally to promote the ideals of emancipation that had been curtailed in the wake of the reaction following the defeat of Napoleon in 1815. This is one of the most important persistent tensions, as one of the great scholars of Wissenschaft des Judentums, Michael Meyer, referred to it in a well-known article. And this becomes a defining feature of Wissenschaft. For Jost, for Zuntz, and for perhaps the next most notable figure as we move along half a generation, Abraham Geiger, who would emerge over the course of the 19th century as the leading reform scholar of the 19th century. And that already hints at the entwinement of scholarship under the rubric of Wissenschaft and the emerging denominational divisions within German Judaism of this period. That is to say, the division into, well, initially beginning with Reform, and then as a reaction, Orthodoxy, and then the attempt to define a middle path, a third way, which would become the progenitor of what we call today conservative Judaism. So these figures, especially Geiger, are involved in Inyané D'Yoma, the issues of the day, including and especially the growing denominational divides that we see in the 19th century in Germany.
Interesting. And so you touched a little bit on this that I want to press down. So, I mean, clearly this was a new way of studying Jewish texts and the Jewish past. Then I have to ask, I mean, what was the content? Meaning, what were the new methods that were being employed by this cadre of scholars? And again, we keep using these terms as though they were one coherent movement. In a way they were, but of course there was a lot of diversity within the movement between figures, between intellectuals, historians, and as you say, some were religiously inclined one way and religiously inclined the other way, and etc. And there's a lot to go there, and we will. But what unified them presumably was this sort of more academic, scientific approach. So I have to ask, drill down a little bit, what is included in this? What are these novel methods? And a little bit as to why they were employed. You mentioned one of them was to make Judaism more palatable in the eyes of others. Is that the extent of it? I mean, what was the motivation for the employment of these particular methods?
To answer that question, I think we have to take one step back and ask, what is it that they were seeking to improve upon? And here, it's essential to note that Wissenschaft des Judentums was, in some sense, a project of reclamation of traditional Jewish sources, and for that matter, Jewish history, from the hands of two groups: traditional rabbinic scholars and Christian scholars who began to evince interest in Jewish sources, particularly the Bible, but who did so from a perspective that held that the spiritual vitality of Judaism essentially expired in antiquity with the destruction of the Second Temple, or even with the end of the biblical period. In fact, that was rendered in German by the term Spät Judentum, late, or we might call it terminal Judaism. And what was concerning to the first cohort of Wissenschaft scholars was the intellectual and scholarly supersessionism of Christian scholars. So that was one polemical and ideological commitment on their part, the Wissenschaft cohort, to reclaim Jewish sources from the hands of Christian scholars, but also to introduce a new critical perspective that would differentiate them from earlier Jewish scholars, from earlier rabbinic commentators, for example, who lacked any understanding of a commitment to the project of contextualization. So one of the important conceptual underpinnings of Wissenschaft des Judentums was the belief that any and every text, event, or actor could be understood within its, his, her, their appropriate historical context, which brings us to one of the most important features of Wissenschaft des Judentums, which is to say the project of historicization, the commitment to historicizing, to understanding in historical terms any actor or event. Once we reach that point, it's important to add a number of other methodological tools that the initial generations of Wissenschaft pretty universally shared. And they were philology, the commitment to the study of language, understanding language, not so much in the ways that contemporary linguists do, but understanding language as the vehicle of expression of a cultural group. So philology, for example, for Truns was an absolutely essential methodological tool. But if we were to sort of zoom out, we would say that the most common methodological tool that was deployed by Wissenschaft scholars was intellectual history, which was somewhat mockingly attributed to one of the key figures of Wissenschaft des Judentums who we haven't mentioned yet, the great macro historian of the 19th century, Heinrich Graetz. He was accused by a later scholar, the second great macro historian of the Jews in the modern age, Shimon Dubnov, of writing a history of learning and suffering. That is to say, Graetz, according to Dubnov, only understood Jewish history in intellectual terms. What were the intellectual products that Jews created? What was the cultural production of Jews? For Dubnov, who came along in the late 19th, early 20th century, he was interested in understanding the material existence of Jews, the social and economic history, as well as the intellectual and cultural. So intellectual history, especially by definition, of cultural elites, was really the bailiwick of Wissenschaft scholars. It's an interesting juxtaposition to non-Jewish contemporaries of Wissenschaft scholars, given that history was undergoing a significant, we might even say monumental expansion over the course of the 19th century in both intellectual and institutional terms, as universities enshrined history as a central discipline to be studied. And when we think of sort of the key figures, and particularly sort of the towering figure in the first half of the 19th century, Leopold von Ranke in Berlin, we think of his commitment to political history. But for Wissenschaft scholars, there was kind of an apprehension that the Jews did not have a political history. What they had was an intellectual history. What they had was a rich cultural legacy. And it was their job as kind of cultural archaeologists to understand the different layers of intellectual production.
Just to ask on that, do you think that was a product of their proximity to the rabbinic world? In other words, this is the hangover from the Bet Midrash or the Cheder, which I mean, some of them would have at least been familiar with, that really saw Jewish life as powered by learning and powered by a scholarly life. I mean, do you think that was bleeding into this view of history as a?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this is so important about the background of the Zunzes and Josts. They came from very traditional backgrounds. They were a half a step out of the world in which rabbinic literature was the dominant, really, regulator of Jewish life. But they also were informed by a commitment to move beyond halacha, Jewish law, as that determinant of every aspect of Jewish life. They believed that belonged to the world of old, and they were, in some sense, there was some part of their work and worldview that was the task of the taxidermist, the person who came to sort of scrutinize and chronicle that which had been concluded. That is to say, the age of vitality of the rabbis. There was some sense of that in the early generations of Wissenschaft des Judentums that they came to really seal off and describe with a kind of forensic dispassion that the world of the rabbis. It's also somewhat of an overstatement, but we do know the great line attributed to the greatest of Jewish bibliographers belonging to the Wissenschaft des Judentums movement later in the 19th century, Moritz Steinschneider, who said the task of Wissenschaft des Judentums was to give Judaism a decent burial. So that spirit, indeed, is a strand in Wissenschaft des Judentums, but I wouldn't reduce Wissenschaft des Judentums to that commitment. Nonetheless, there was a sense amongst this first generation that there was now a lull in the cultural production of Jews, and that it was their task through scholarship to embark on a project of revitalization of Jewish culture.
That's fascinating because, of course, those are two different strands, and they are, to a certain degree, I wouldn't say contradictory, but certainly in tension. In other words, the sense that in a way the vitality of the Jews had been sapped, and it was important to chronicle it, but also to revitalize it at the same time.
Right. Well, I would say tension, or as you described it, contradiction, is a defining feature of Wissenschaft des Judentums. I mean, there were a generation caught at the crossroads of competing currents, very much feeling themselves in a state of upheaval and perplexity. It's no surprise that around this time, someone in a companion tradition, a parallel tradition to Wissenschaft des Judentums, which I'd call Chochmat Yisrael, which was a Hebrew writing tradition of Jewish scholarship, by the name of Nachman Krochmal, wrote a book called Moreh Nevuchei Hazman, a guide to the perplexed of the time, playing off of Maimonides' great work of philosophy, the guide for the perplexed. This was a time of perplexity, and there are many countervailing currents that intersect to create this moment. And that, I think, lends it its great intrigue and power. I would say that the bane of existence of the historian, both the person who is swimming in the current themselves and casting a glance on the past, is calmness and absence of tension. We historians look for this in order to go about our business.
So in which case, I would like to ask then, I mean, was there a sense, a twofold question. Number one, was there a sense among the Wissenschaft scholars that they were, in fact, doing something radically new? Or were they trying to place themselves in the great tradition of Jewish study and Jewish scholarship? Because, of course, for centuries and centuries, the learning of Jewish texts had been de rigueur, been at the center of the Jewish curriculum, and they were doing the same thing. I mean, these were people who ostensibly were rebelling against the rabbinic tradition, but were also spending all their time studying Jewish texts and Jewish intellectual history. So did they think they would do something radically new? Did they present themselves as such? Or did they see themselves essentially as the next stage organically within the tradition?
The answer to that is yes. Which is to
Right.
say, I'd say the declared goal was to undertake a radically new project and means of understanding the Jewish sources, and to, in some sense, not attend simply to the cultivation of the garden of rabbinic commentary passed on over generation, in which you have a kind of trans-historical communication between a commentator in the 12th century and a commentator in the 18th century. They saw that, they stepped out of that Shalshel Takabbalah, out of that chain of tradition. They indeed, if you go back to Tzunz's programmatic essay from 1818, this was an entirely new, sweeping way of understanding Judaism. At the same time, they had their heroes. One of Tzunz's early studies was devoted to Rashi, another great figure from the Chochmat Yisrael tradition, a man known by the acronym SHIR, Shlomo Yehuda Rappaport, was a great biographer of rabbinic figures. So They were indeed not just interested in some of the great figures, Rashi, Rambam, Ramban, Ibn Ezra, but they saw some measure of affinity in what they did. And as we know later in the century, there's a pronounced infatuation by German Jewish scholars, thinkers, authors in the medieval and early modern Hispanic or Sephardic experience. There's a kind of apprehension, a sense that what Jews are undergoing in Germany was adumbrated by what Jews in Spain underwent in terms of the attempt at convivencia, at a kind of cultural symbiosis. There's a kind of interest in earlier Sephardic figures and a sense of identification with them in part, all the while that they really believe they are marked on something new. And what was emblematic of the newness of it was the designation Wissenschaft, science, which both alluded to the comprehensiveness of the project, because Wissenschaft in the early 19th century really conveyed that sense of intellectual holism. And it referred to the quest to achieve a level not just of scholarly objectivity, but by extension of acceptance by non-Jewish scholars of the integrity and virtue of this scholarly undertaking. So Wissenschaft really signaled something altogether new.
And I suppose the example of being infatuated with medieval Spain is especially poignant now that we know the fate of German Jewry, that on the one hand they did achieve this extraordinary cultural symbiosis, but on the other hand their ultimate fate was destruction, of course. And that's
and as we know, and this is a point that wasn't always remembered, the same or a major catastrophe befell the Jews of Spain as well in 1492. That was often neglected in favor of an appreciation of the cultural vitality of Spanish Jewry.
Right. Interesting. If I may ask, were there particular subjects within Jewish text and Jewish history that the Wissenschaft scholars decided to focus on? Because, of course, the curriculum of the Beit Midrash, of the Cheder and the Yeshiva, which some of them would have come from, was very specific and hadn't changed in centuries. Whereas, of course, a hallmark of the Wissenschaft movement was a far broader focus within Jewish history. So were there some subjects that they particularly focused on, some subjects they avoided, some things they like to talk about more than others? Where was there, I mean, the broad question, but the principal focus?
Yeah, I would say as a general matter, Wissenschaft scholars were interested in post-biblical Jewish intellectual history. And that is because there was a kind of trepidation about falling into the approach to the Bible being practiced by Christian scholars in the 19th century. That is to say, in the form of higher biblical criticism, which Solomon Schechter famously referred to as higher anti-Semitism. So that was felt to be, that is to say, a critical analysis of the Hebrew Bible was felt to be, in some sense, too hot to touch and too likely to subvert the goals of furthering the path to emancipation that Wissenschaft scholars imagined their work contributing to. They feared engaging in the Bible might lend credence to Christian supersessionist sensibilities that saw the Hebrew Bible as the Old Testament that had effectively was the lower level of the edifice of biblical theology. There are some exceptions to that. In fact, the key figures, some of whom I mentioned, Sunz, Geiger, Gretz, all undertook various forms of study of the Bible, oftentimes focused on biblical commentary. But more generally, it's fair to say that Wissenschaft scholars were interested in medieval history, the history of rabbis, quite ironically, not sort of immerging themselves in the pipeline of rabbinic commentary, but rather studying the rabbinic commentators, some of whom I mentioned, the main figures, Rashi, Rambam, Ibn Ezra, as reflections of vibrant Jewish cultures. One thing that was also part of the commitment of these scholars was to understand both the wider non-Jewish context in which these figures emerged, and to make use of non-Jewish sources, something that earlier generations of say, rabbinic scholars, did not practice themselves. So what I think we can say is that there was a commitment to the study of both Ashkenazic and Sephardic culture through the lens of intellectual history and philology. And that's a project that really, I'd say, went from the Middle Ages up through the 18th century. We might say that the 11th to the 18th centuries were the period which early Wissenschaft scholars really focused their attention upon. Both Ashkenazic and Sephardic history. As we move later into the 19th century, there's much more of a reverence for celebration of Sephardic history.
Interesting. It is, I suppose, a tad ironic that precisely the later decades of the 19th century, when the Wissenschaft was in its heyday to a certain extent, there was also a golden age of more traditional parshanut. So, Rav Hirsch and the Netziv and Ktav HaKabbalah and the Malbim and all these people who were writing at the time and producing excellent Orthodox parshanut for the first time really in centuries. And the Wissenschaft had kind of were studying those of the past, but
right. So I think we might say that there's a dialectic at work, that Wissenschaft posed a challenge. I mean, posed a challenge in a very direct way to the world of the yeshiva. How are we going to retain very smart young Bechurim who might be drawn to this new approach, given sort of the opening of Europe and the specter of enlightenment? How can we retain them? We have to up our game as well. But I think, there are also just sort of new critical thinking informed what had been a traditional field of biblical and rabbinic criticism. Rav Hirsch, Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, is a very interesting figure in the history of Wissenschaft des Judentums because he is perhaps its most important 19th century critic. He himself was sort of exposed to a German university education, was indeed a great lover of German culture, in some sense swam in the same cultural seas as did the practitioners of Wissenschaft. He himself was a teacher of Heinrich Gretz, knew who these figures were, but departed from them not merely in methodological and conceptual terms, but really in theological terms as well, which is to say, they understood Judaism as a cultural tradition that was constantly evolving historically. And Rav Hirsch understood Judaism as an essence, as an essential condition whose core features remained the same, and thus was completely unwilling to, and in fact was quite critical of, those who sought to subject the oral Torah to a historical contextualization, not to mention the written Torah. And that was one of the great divides between the Wissenschaft scholars and those who we might designate under the rubric neo-Orthodox, associated with Rav Hirsch.
Interesting. And would you say, I mean, obviously Rav Hirsch is criticizing them, as you mentioned, largely because of his proximity to them. I mean, geographical proximity. He lived in cities near them or sometimes with them in Frankfurt. But also because, as you say, he was swimming in German culture. He was reading in German. He was reading their books and their journals. But did the Wissenschaft penetrate further eastwards within Europe? Did it have its critics within the more traditional Eastern Orthodox world, or had they simply not heard of them?
Yes, it was known in Eastern European rabbinic culture in the 19th century and regarded as a grave threat to the integrity of Eastern European Jewish culture at a time when traditional Eastern European Jewish culture was being subjected to all sorts of threats. It was a period of time in which the Haskalah movement, which originated in Berlin, according to most historical accounts, there's a revisionist version by the historian Olga Litvak that we need to take seriously, but there was, in my view, an eastward movement of the Haskalah movement. It coincided with the emergence and fortification of this tradition of modern scholarship in the Hebrew language known as Chochmat Yisrael, where figures like Nachman Krochmal, whom I mentioned before, known as the Ranak, were central personalities. And in the wake of the Haskalah movement, Chochmat Yisrael, and this German language Wissenschaft des Judentums movement, which was attracting interest in the East. Traditional upholders of rabbinic culture were extremely anxious and very often directed a fierce criticism at it. A number of historians like Asaf Yedidia in Israel have written extensively about the Orthodox criticism of Wissenschaft des Judentums, beginning with Rav Hirsch and extending to the East. Again, I would say that there's a dialectical tension here in ways that call to mind L.A. Stern's treatment of the Gra, the Vilna Gaon, in his book on the Vilna Gaon, a kind of dialectical process by which there's some osmotic absorption of currents emanating from the West, while at the same time, what is very often articulated explicitly is a critique of that very project.
And there were, of course, some who straddled this line. So I'm thinking particularly of David Zvi Hoffman, of Hirsch's great pupils. So this is already late 19th, early 20th century, where the sort of the Hildesheimer approach and Hoffman was somewhere in the middle, was accepting partially of the Wissenschaft approach, but also refuting parts of it. I mean, could you perhaps shed a little light on this kind of neo-Orthodox yet sympathetic to Wissenschaft school?
Absolutely. This requires, if you'll permit me, one step backward to call attention to a very significant development in the history of Wissenschaft des Judentums. So we talked about the founding generation of the Verein. It was a loose association of scholars, and the association lasted about 3 years. A very significant development in the history of Wissenschaft occurs in mid-century with the founding of the Jewish Theological Seminary in Breslau, because this becomes home to Jewish studies scholars, those university-trained scholars whom I mentioned before, who could not find their way into the university as professors, as teachers. They were permitted to study in the universities, but they were not permitted to teach in the universities in their designated field. Over the course of the 19th century, Geiger and Sunz appealed to German authorities to create Jewish studies programs in German universities, and they were uniformly rejected. As a result, Jewish studies as an academic discipline retreated to or found its home in modern style rabbinical seminaries, the first of which was established in 1853 in Breslau by a figure named Zacharias Frankel, a great scholar, Prague-born scholar of the 19th century, who wrote a book, Darchei Mishnah, that was vigorously critiqued by Rav Hirsch as being too historicist. Heinrich Gretz found his first institutional home in Breslau. What's interesting is that about 20 years later, we see the development of two other rabbinical seminaries. In 1872, a rabbinical seminary for the emerging reform movement in Germany, known as the Hochschule für die Wissenschaft des Judentums, and in 1873, a modern Orthodox seminary, a modern Orthodox seminary, which we might call today modern Orthodox, founded by a very interesting figure named Azriel Hildesheimer, whom you mentioned, which attracted to it university-trained scholars committed both to critical scholarship and to Orthodox practice. And for them, it was a very delicate balancing act, especially when it came to dealing with the classical sources, the written Torah and the oral Torah. You mentioned David Zvi Hoffman. He is one of the main figures to emerge out of the Hildesheimer Seminary, and really treaded this very delicate line between critical approaches to the study of the Jewish past and ongoing commitment to the belief in the divine origins of the written and oral Torah. So his critical capacities could be directed at sources other than the oral law, but he actually tried to argue on historical grounds that it would be a mistake to reduce the Torah Shebaal Peh, the oral Torah, to a series of contextual contexts that failed to get at its divine origins. This was a very difficult balancing act. In many ways, his work was accepted widely in the larger scholarly community, but it reflected this attempted mediation of two impulses. That was true, I should say, for all of these institutional settings. Each of them sought its own mediation of tradition and modernity. Geiger was the Eminence Gries, the great figure of the Hochschule in its first years, and he adopted what he called an evolutionary approach to the study of Jewish history and believed that the current moment, the age of emancipation, had moved beyond or surpassed the age of, as he called it, rigid legalism. But at the same time, he was deeply committed to understanding the integrity of Jewish history, to an appreciation for some elements of the tradition, consistent with many of his Reform colleagues. There's a renewed appreciation of the Hebrew prophetic tradition. Meanwhile, in the first institutional setting, Breslau, Frankel and Gretz sought their own mediation, and it took the form of what they called positive historical Judaism. That was the name they gave to their approach, their hashkafa of both scholarship and Judaism, meaning there should be a positive approach to the sources of Judaism, not an excessively critical one, but there should also be an historical understanding that Judaism evolved over time. And that, I think, is another iteration of that attempted mediation that we see in all three of these institutional settings.
So as you say, Wissenschaft strongly intersected with the rise, I suppose, of denominations within Judaism, the 1840s, 1850s. And I suppose it's a bit of an unfair question because historians don't love to speculate exactly on causes. But to what degree would you say that the rise of a scientific study of Judaism was behind the emergence of distinct denominations? In other words, is it fair to say no Wissenschaft, no reform, right?
Not fair to say that. It is fair to say, I'll explain why in a second. It is fair to say that Wissenschaft undeniably sharpened denominational boundary lines in Germany. What is important to say is that these two developments, Reform and Wissenschaft, are occurring around the same time. The second decade of the 19th century is the major decade of interest for both. We see the creation of the first major Reform house of worship, known as the Hamburg Temple in 1817, 1818, that prompts a ferocious response by traditionalist rabbis who will come to be known as Orthodox. They put together a series of, I think it's 22 or 23 rabbinical opinions collected in 1819 under the title Ele Divrei Habrit. These are the words of the covenant. And it's a evisceration of the new approaches to Jewish ritual and liturgy that were introduced into Hamburg a few years earlier. It's important to note that some of the early figures of Wissenschaft des Judentums, Zuns in particular, are part of these initial reform circles, though he himself would develop a very ambivalent relationship towards reform. But both share the desire to present to the wider German world a form of Judaism that is worthy of respect and admiration. They do share that sort of outward facing commitment and goal of rendering Judaism acceptable in the broader environment. Some, like Gershom Scholem, the great 20th century scholar of Kabbalah, in his famous essay from 1944 called Mitoch Hihurim al Chochmat Israel, from within reflections on Wissenschaft des Judentums, regarded that impulse as craven, as reflective of their, I think as he referred to it, historical suicide. I think that's a very unfair criticism. Yes, they were committed to rendering Judaism acceptable to the wider world as a way of re-engaging the process of emancipation. And yes, they were committed to the reform of Judaism from within. But what you can't say about them is that they were detached from Jewish life, that they had no sense of commitment to the importance of ongoing Jewish life. Indeed, not in the old form, but in a new form. They were deeply engaged scholars for whom, as I refer to it, the identitarian or existential considerations that they had were central to their formulation of the scholarly lens through which they observed the Jewish past.
Absolutely, and this is why the oft-trotted-out quote, which you mentioned earlier by Moritz Steinschneider, of affording Judaism a decent burial, is a strange accusation in a way, because so many of the Wissenschaft scholars were foundational to Jewish institutions, Jewish communities, Jewish ways of life. Some of them were rabbis. Some of them, it's a very strange accusation to my mind. You mentioned their acceptance in the broader world, and of course, on that score, so it seems anyway, they failed. As you mentioned before, they were not accepted onto faculties of any major Germanic university. There was no professorships of Jewish studies. Why was this? Was this simple anti-Semitism? Was there a deeper intellectual reason at play? I mean, did German academics simply not want Jews next to them in the faculty lounges? What was the reason for their general rejection within their universities?
Well, it's in part um, a reflection of that classic slogan, really epitaph of the modern Jewish experience in Europe, given voice to by a young deputy in the French National Assembly in 1789, debating the question of whether the Jews too should qualify for emancipation. They too should be included under the Declaration of the Rights of Man, or whether they're a separate case that stood outside of the general principle that humanity, subjects of France, should become citizens. Clement Tonnerre, the young deputy, said, "Everything to the Jews as individuals, nothing to the Jews as a nation." In other words, the terms of the terms of admission, the ticket of admission, as Heinrich Heine, who was a founding member of the Verein, Heine said the ticket of admission for Jews to European culture was conversion. We might alter that to say the ticket of admission was to strip down one's sense of Jewish collectivity, rid oneself of sort of the vestigial forms of Jewish clannishness in order to make one's way into polite society. And it turns out that slogan, or the social contract implicit in that, was not upheld by Europe over the course of the 19th century. As Jews crossed the threshold to this new edifice of Enlightenment Europe, the door began to close on them because of lingering anti-Jewish expression and belief. I think it's hard to understand the restrictions placed on Jewish scholars in ways other than that. And it was that condition was quite crazy making, in a literal sense, for some Jews. The first president of the Verein für Kultur und Wissenschaft der Juden, Edward Gans, a scholar of Roman law, a student of Hegel, converted in 1825 in order to get a professorial position. That was the only way he could do so. So those ongoing anti-Jewish restrictions led to the creation of what David Sorkin calls a Jewish subculture within Germany. And within that subculture, there were robust institutions like the rabbinical seminaries, like learned societies, that stood in parallel. So in that regard, Schollem's famous line in his correspondence with Hannah Arendt after the Eichmann trial is, I think, true when he said the German-Jewish relationship was a case of an unrequited love. One side loved the other, and the other did not love that second side. That said, I think I don't adopt Schollem's belief that the entire project was a colossal failure at all. I think it was a generator, an extraordinary generator of Jewish culture, modern Jewish culture, and the foundation for what has become one of the most important forms of Jewish culture in the 20th and 21st centuries, which is to say university-based Jewish studies.
Right. And we'll get to that. But it's very interesting what Sorkin says, because I suppose I never thought about it before. It was precisely because Jewish academics were rejected from universities that Jewish institutions were set up. That the seminaries in Breslau and in Berlin and elsewhere were Jews who, because they couldn't get a position elsewhere, created these centers of Jewish learning and excellence. I mean, not exclusively, but
that was one reason. That I'd say that was the sufficient condition, the necessary condition for or rationale for the creation of these institutions was the need to train rabbis in a modern vein, which itself was part of the project of attempting to make Judaism acceptable to the wider world. And we can talk about the success of that project. And at some level, that was a success. It wasn't a complete failure. But what that meant was that rabbis now should not just be students of Gemara and codes, but they should study subjects like Jewish history, hence Heinrich Kretz, Jewish literature, homiletics, and other subjects that allowed them to develop their professional capacities as rabbis, because this was also about the transformation of the very idea of what a rabbi was. The rabbi wasn't any longer merely a teacher. The rabbi was now the shepherd of a congregation, and it was necessary for that rabbi to have all sorts of skills above and beyond proficiency in rabbinic literature. So that's also a very important driver of the rabbinical seminary. But as you say, an additional rationale was it was the home that university-trained Jewish studies scholars could find for themselves in Germany in the 19th century.
Fascinating. Okay. There's another subject that I have to broach here, which is the intersection of Wissenschaft with the emergent Jewish nationalism and Zionism. And interesting, the subtitle of one of your early books is European Jewish Intellectuals and the Zionist Return to History. I was arrested by that phrase, return to history, because, of course, it is a double entendre, which I'm sure you meant it as such, in the sense that Jews at the time, specifically in the Wissenschaft movement, were returning to history in the sense of returning to the study of history, the understanding of history, and conceiving of the importance of history, but also the push to return the Jewish people to the processes of history, to make it a normal nation again, to allow it to resemble its full height as a nation, which in the eyes of several thinkers, especially in the late 19th century, meant national existence and specifically reconstitution in their homeland, namely Zionism. So, I mean, this is a very large question, but to what degree, again, it's similar to my question with reform, to what degree can we say that the Wissenschaft return to history fueled or underwrote the Zionist return to history in the national sense?
So it would be a kind of traditional view to say Zionism and Zionist scholarship regarded themselves as the antithesis of Wissenschaft des Judentums, a project committed to the assimilation of Jews into German society. Scholem and his cohort in Weimar Germany regarded themselves as post-assimilatory Jews. That was a key driver toward their Zionism. But I think that's an overly simplistic contrast or juxtaposition. One can't understand the founding generation of scholars at the Institute for Jewish Studies at the Hebrew University, the paradigmatic Zionist national institution, except as products of Wissenschaft des Judentums. They emerged out of that very tradition. Their sense of the importance of scholarship and of Wissenschaft in particular emerged from that tradition. People like Scholem said Wissenschaft scholars were too committed to their kind of communal and existential concerns to actually realize the goal of science. We, who have returned to a place of stability for Jews, to the land of Israel, can now create that perch at which an objective view of the past can be obtained. But Scholem at the same time said, we've returned to the living currents of Jewish national life, which to me points to the deep contradiction within Scholem's own vision of a pure science on one hand and a deep commitment to Zionism on the other. We know that in Scholem's case, it was the dual commitments to a sense of the vitality of Zionism that really triggered his interest in the demonic forces in Jewish history. That is the
counter history.
The way he described Kabbalah as a kind of a counter history to the normative rabbinic strain. So what I would say is, although they polemicized against Wissenschaft scholars, many of that first generation of Zionist historians really emerged out of that same tradition. They were trained in German institutions, were familiar with the scholarship of Wissenschaft des Judentums, and very often continued, certainly in Scholem's case, with the kind of philological and intellectual historical approach of the 19th century scholars. He, in his case, happened to study a different body of literature. He somewhat overstated the case about how completely uninterested Wissenschaft scholars were in Kabbalah, but nonetheless, let's accept the proposition that he kind of invented this new field of study. Many of the methods were quite similar. It is the case that earlier Wissenschaft scholars were not interested in the demonic forces of Jewish history. That kind of subversion of normativity was part of Sholom's own understanding of the key vitality of Zionism. And it's also important to note that for that, Sholem was bitterly attacked by the renowned literary scholar, Orthodox literary scholar, Baruch Kurzweil, who taught at Bar Ilan University, who said Sholem's interest in the demonic is perverse and is intent on undermining any sense of a living Judaism. He also pilloried Sholem for holding to this notion of an objective science, which he saw as a form of apotheosis, as a form of avodah zarah, as a form of idolatry, by elevating science to the ultimate standard of validation rather than the divine. And this reminds us of one of the most compelling lines in Sholem's article in 1944 critiquing Wissenschaft des Judentums, when he said, not referring to himself but his colleagues, "We came to rebel and we ended up continuing." And I would say there's a great deal of continuity between the two schools and a great deal, and also a noticeable degree of ideological divergence.
And that is definitely the case. But even, I would say, let's say late 19th century, the sort of the very flowerings of the Zionist movement, it is often, as you say, the popular conception often is that historians like Heinrich Gretz, for instance, who managed to put together a coherent, sweeping grand narrative of Jewish history that showed the Jews to be a continuing, contrary to the beliefs of the Christian intellectual supersessionists at Germanic universities, showed the Jewish people to be this civilization which never ceased in its vitality and never stopped producing people and never stopped being a full nation in its complete sense. That the general idea is that contributed to the creation of a movement like Zionism. I mean, is there something to that?
Yeah, I think there's something to that. My student, Professor Jeff Bludinger, has called attention, who's written biography of Gretz, really spends a good deal of time talking about Gretz as the expositor of an amalgam of sensibilities known as National Judaism, National Judentum, a kind of intermediate phase between the earlier assimilatory impulse of the founding generation of Wissenschaft and a full-blown nationalist historiography. And we see that perhaps most clearly in a bitter polemic that broke out in the late 1870s, when one of Germany's leading historians, Heinrich von Treitschke, undertook a review of volume 11 of Gretz's 11-volume History of the Jews, which he described, Treitschke, as unmistakably anti-German and anti-Christian. And indeed, one only need read a few lines of Gretz's work to understand the enormous passion and sense of identification with his favored Jewish subjects, and by the way, his vilification of his less favored Jewish subjects. Gretz had the idea of Jews as constituting a distinct cultural group. The period in which he was writing, and Treitschke was critiquing him, the 1870s, was a period in which the very term anti-Semitism is born. It's also a very interesting period in other parts of Europe for Jews. The scholar Adolf Jelinek is talking about a distinct Jewish stam or tribe or ethnic group. Hebrew writers like Peretz Smolenskin are putting out journals such as Hashachar, which contain within them both these new scholarly currents and an incipient sense of Jewish nationalism. So I think your instinct is absolutely right to say that last quarter of the 19th century is one in which we see a kind of fusion of these currents, a sense that Judaism will not be revived without a serious intellectual and even scholarly catalyst or catalyzer. And that period is such an interesting period between earlier Wissenschaft and sort of more fully developed Jewish nationalism. It's a kind of intermediate period, but one in which we see currents of both of these impulses. I'll also say that as Jews come to embrace and take ownership over a sense of nationalism, tout court, in and of itself, there is an important methodological innovation that we see that Dubnov, whom I mentioned before, the Russian Jewish historian Shimon Dubnov, really reflected quite well. And that is a commitment to understanding the material existence of the Jews, not just the spiritual existence of the Jews, as was the case with that sort of intellectual historical approach. That development, what I call the materialization of the Jewish past, coincides with the emergence of nationalism as a very important force in Jewish life, particularly in Europe.
Interesting. Because, of course, nationalism, especially Zionism, includes the embrace of all aspects of Jewish life and Jewish living, not just the intellectual part and not just the part that remains in the library. I mean, it's
right. So its advocates said they believed
right.
They were attempting or undertaking an histoire totale, as the French would say, a total history. But we came to rebel and ended up continuing. There's a lot of that as well. Indeed, there are continuators of the Dubnovian line, and there are continuators of the Gretzian and Sunzian lines in Jerusalem. That's what makes that first generation of scholars at the Hebrew University so very interesting. They contain many different currents, such that we can't speak of a single unified Jerusalem school, as used to be the case. I've suggested that we refer to them as the Jerusalem scholars, who don't reflect a unified view, but rather an amalgam of diverse methodological and ideological sensibilities.
Interesting. Okay, that's fascinating. Our time is drawing soon to a close. So I want to ask, I mean, do you see the Wissenschaft, the Judentums movement as having an endpoint? Or do you see the extraordinary flowering of Jewish studies in the last half century, post-war in the United States and in Europe and in Israel? Do you see that as the direct heir of the Wissenschaft movement? In other words, was it a movement that petered out, or on the contrary, is it one of the most successful modern Jewish movements, that existed?
Yes. This is a movement that, by definition, was brought to an end in the most brutal, violent fashion. It is interesting to note, as a number of scholars have called attention to, and here I should just acknowledge some of the great scholars of Wissenschaft des Judentums. I mentioned Michael Meyer. Another one of the greatest scholars of Wissenschaft des Judentums is Ismar Schorsch. It's interesting that Schorsch and Meyer are amongst the leading representatives of the conservative and reform movements in America, and in that sense are continuators of the 19th century tradition. But the period from 1933 to 1939 was a period of intense cultural productivity in Germany, as there was an ever-emerging sense of the narrowing of Jewish life and the specter of an end to the thousand-year-old German Jewish experience. That impulse actually hastened the pace of cultural productivity, but at a certain point, Wissenschaft des Judentums was extinguished, quite literally. But I don't think we can understand the extraordinary efflorescence of Jewish studies in North America, in Israel, and increasingly in Europe, as well as other places, Australia, South Africa, Latin America, without understanding the foundation of Wissenschaft des Judentums. We simply would not have a vibrant world of Jewish studies as we know it today without Wissenschaft des Judentums. It is the essential precondition to the efflorescence of Jewish studies in the 20th and 21st centuries.
So if Gretz and Sunz were invited to the AJS conference, you'd think they'd look around and say, "Ah, yes, I recognize this. This is good."
Well, no, I don't know that we'd say that, because in his incredible programmatic essay from 1818, Sunz cast doubt on the fact that there would be any Hebrew literary production 100 years hence, that is to say, in the year 1918. So a clairvoyant he wasn't. He was better at predicting the past than the future. But I am sure that he and Gretz would be astounded, and I surmise thrilled by what they saw at a World Congress for Jewish Studies or at an AJS.
Okay. And finally, just before I let you go, because this has been wonderful and I wish we could continue another hour, a question that I asked many of my guests, if you could pick one of these figures to sit down with for dinner tonight, firstly, who would it be? And secondly, what would you be asking them? What conversation would you broach with any of these Wissenschaft figures?
Well, insofar as I am an historian, and it's hard to designate Sunz in particular as an historian because he sort of operated his methodological eclecticism, which was so winning and important to the growth of the field, may prevent us from saying he was a historian, simply put, per se. Gretz would be the figure. Just the mix of enormous erudition, iconoclasm, and passion all speak to me greatly. And I guess I would ask him a question similar to that implicit in your last question, which is, as we move into the 1880s, a period in which we see the birth of the very term anti-Semitism, the emergence of anti-Semitism, I'd love to ask him, because these are the kinds of questions I ask all the time in my various professional lives. What does the past illuminate about both the present and future? Where do you think German Jewry will be going in light of what was known as the Antisemitismusstreit with Treitschke, the battle of anti-Semitism that took place in Berlin, 1879 to 1881? Where do you think the future of German Jewry lies? That's certainly one question, maybe an unfair question, but I'm a believer that the past can illuminate the present and future. I'd also like to ask him, insofar as he evinced so much passion for those whom he loved and those whom he hated. Spinoza, Shabtai Tzvi, two of his great 17th century subjects. I'd like to ask him, what was your favorite period of Jewish history? Where would you like to be transplanted to? Sort of a conventional answer is first century Palestine, in the midst of all of this fermentation from the Jesus movement to the destruction of the Second Temple, and then the creation of Yavne. But it might well be back to Cordoba or Freistadt or Amsterdam in the 17th century. So that's a question I'd like to pose to him.
Fascinating. Or I suspect even just a century earlier for him to meet Moses Mendelssohn. He seems like he would have thoroughly enjoyed that. Okay, I think we have to draw the curtain down here. Thank you so much, Professor Myers, for joining us here on the podcast of Jewish Ideas. This has been a wonderful conversation, and I look forward to hearing the feedback from our listeners. Thank you so much for joining us.
Great to be with you today.
This has been the podcast of Jewish Ideas by Torah in Motion, produced by Alicia Kelman and myself, JJ Kimchi. Edited and mixed by Alicia Kelman. You can stay up to date by subscribing in your favorite podcast app. To support more thoughtful Jewish content like this, please visit TorahInMotion.org/donate.